So serious about the protest movement.
Yes, they are.
But they were so flippant that they were singing a happy-go-lucky song, which happens to be one I wrote. And I'm glad they sang it. And when I get there, I'll sing it with them. When I get in.
John Lennon of the Beatles was not only known as a creative genius and a symbol of peace, but he was also a deeply complex individual, constantly haunted and tormented by wounds and profound inner conflicts. When he passed away, unexpectedly, at the age of 40, the public discovered a secret notebook that Lennon had kept hidden all along, in which he had written down the names of people he despised for life. This list astonished many. It included legendary musicians, a close friend who had betrayed him, and, most notably, the detail that shocked the most people, the name of the head of the Washington administration, the very person who had drawn Lennon into a brutal legal battle. So who were these people? And what drove John Lennon to keep that list secret until the very last moments of his life? John Lennon was one of the few individuals whose childhood and entire life were filled with contradictions, tragedies, and inexplicable paradoxes. He was born in 1940 in the port city of Liverpool, right at the moment when World War II was raging fiercely. John's childhood was intertwined with the sounds of falling bombs, a constant sense of insecurity, and harsh deprivation. His parents divorced early, and the young boy went to live with his Aunt Mimi, while his biological mother, Julia, visited frequently, but did not raise him directly. It was she who placed a banjo in her son's hands, planting the first seed of the love for music that would later flourish in his heart. Tragedy struck too early in Lennon's life. In 1958, when he was only 17 years old, his mother suddenly died in a traffic accident right outside their home. The shock left a deep scar in his mind, becoming a persistent pain that haunted him for the rest of his life. Later, songs such as Julia and Mother became his anguished voices, silent cries of a child who had permanently lost his mother. From a young age, John was known as a stubborn boy, prone to fighting, and frequently criticized by his teachers. However, in the fields of painting and music, he displayed remarkable, innate talent. In 1956, Lennon formed the band The Quarrymen, where he met Paul McCartney and later George Harrison. The Lennon-McCartney partnership quickly became a legendary duo, helping to propel the Beatles into becoming the greatest band in history. Within the Beatles, Lennon was the rebellious soul. Often controversial, he left a profound mark with a series of timeless songs such as Help, All You Need Is Love, and Come Together. Yet behind that dazzling fame, Lennon often felt constrained by his celebrity, haunted by the losses of his childhood, and frequently appeared in the press for making shocking statements. Ultimately, tragedy caught up with him. On the evening of December 8, 1980, John Lennon was shot right outside the Dakota apartment in New York, leaving this world at only 40 years old, far too young for such a great talent. News of his death spread immediately across newspapers, causing many people to cry as they read the headlines on the streets. During his life, John Lennon was celebrated as a symbol of peace and the desire for freedom, yet he was also a deeply contradictory person. After his passing, a notebook was discovered in which Lennon candidly recorded the names of people he disliked, including some famous colleagues of his time. This revealed that he was both great and complex, a boundlessly creative soul, yet one burdened with pain and inner turmoil. Perhaps it was precisely these tragedies and contradictions that shaped John Lennon, a musician who not only wrote songs, but also helped define an entire era. 1. Paul McCartney, from closest friend to bitter enemy. John Lennon and Paul McCartney were not just bandmates, they were also closest friends. It was from this deep bond that a series of timeless Beatles songs were born. The whole world recognized that Lennon and McCartney complemented each other perfectly, forming a near indivisible whole. However, by the late 1960s, the first cracks began to appear. During the recording of the Let It Be album, 1969, Paul gradually took control of the studio. He repeatedly demanded that the other members redo takes or follow his directions, making Lennon feel constrained and prompting him to sarcastically refer to Paul as the schoolmaster. This tension was also clearly visible in documentary footage. George Harrison, with a cold demeanor, responded to Paul, "Whatever you want me to play, I'll play. Or I won't play anything at all if that's what you want." The oppressive atmosphere seemed to foreshadow a massive storm about to break. That storm finally erupted in December 1970, when Paul McCartney officially filed a lawsuit against the other three members to dissolve Apple Corps and free himself from Alan Klein's management control. To John, George, and Ringo, this action was nothing short of a betrayal. The lawsuit not only marked the official end of the Beatles, but also transformed the Lennon-McCartney relationship from one of closest friendship into an open, direct confrontation. John Lennon could not hide his anger. On his Imagine album, 1971, he released the song How Do You Sleep?, a direct attack on Paul. The song contained many biting and sarcastic lines, such as, "Those old songs of yours used to be good, now they're just lullabies," and "All you've done is yesterday, and since leaving the Beatles, you've done nothing at all." Paul's pain deepened when George Harrison, the friend he still regarded as close, played the slide guitar on that very mocking track. Lennon did not stop at music. He also attacked Paul in the media. In an interview with Rolling Stone magazine, 1971, he called Paul a mediocre musician, only capable of writing sweet and easy pop songs. He openly criticized Paul's solo album Ram as garbage, and even implied that Paul plagiarized and rode on the fame of the Beatles. Yet amidst the wreckage, a few glimmers of light remained. In the mid-1970s, Lennon and McCartney met again, and even had an impromptu jam session in New York, 1904. However, they never officially reunited, nor did they fully repair the crack in their friendship. On December 8, 1980, when the gunshot claimed John Lennon's life outside the Dakota building, Paul McCartney lost not only a former bandmate, but also a part of his own soul. Many years later, when recalling John, Paul still became tearful, calling him the greatest friend and brother, despite the bitterness that had once tainted their relationship. If the confrontation between Lennon and McCartney was bitter enough, the real trigger behind the Beatles' breakup extended beyond music alone. Behind Paul stood a powerful family, always ready to intervene, and it was they who pushed Lennon and the remaining members into an unprecedented crisis in the history of the band. 2. Elvis Presley, commercial icon, who lost his rebellious spirit. In 1950s Liverpool, John Lennon, who was just a young boy at the time, would often sit alone in his small room, completely absorbed in listening to the sounds coming from his old radio. These melodies were not classical compositions or somber tunes, but the voice of Elvis Presley, the young man with his daring hip-shaking moves, an image that strongly challenged the conservative American society of the era. In many interviews later in life, Lennon admitted, "Before Elvis, there was nothing." It was precisely Elvis's rebelliousness, his captivating spirit of freedom, that drove Lennon to pick up a guitar and form the Quarrymen, the precursor to the legendary Beatles. In Lennon's eyes at that time, Elvis Presley was truly an untouchable god. As time passed, Lennon's youthful dream eventually became reality. On August 27, 1965, the Beatles, who by then had achieved worldwide fame, were scheduled to meet Elvis at his luxurious Beverly Hills mansion. Lennon was overjoyed, yet that excitement quickly faded. Before them was no longer the rebel of the past, but a distant, safe Hollywood star, eyes glued to the television, creating an awkward and dull atmosphere. Later, Lennon recalled that Elvis had lost his fire. During the 1970s, he openly criticized, "Elvis died the day he joined the army." Lennon believed that from 1958 onward, when Presley abandoned his wild image in favor of a tame persona suited to the conservative American market, the king of rock had become nothing more than a commercial machine, even a product fully exploited by the U.S. government. The peak of his disappointment came in 1970, when the media published photos of a smiling Elvis shaking hands with President Nixon. For Lennon, who was actively protesting the war, this scene was nothing short of a betrayal. In later conversations, he even sarcastically remarked that Elvis had become merely a mirror of submission to the system. In John Lennon's heart, two images of Elvis Presley existed side by side. One as the rock and roll king who paved the way for the genre's explosion, inspiring a young boy in Liverpool to dream big, and the other as a man who later willingly abandoned his rebellious spirit, blending into the ranks of authority. For this reason, Lennon felt both pain and anger. Elvis had been the one to open the door into the world of rock for him. Yet in the end, he was also the one who slammed that door shut through his compromise with the very powers Lennon despised. If, in Elvis's case, Lennon's disappointment stemmed from a hero gradually turning into a commercial icon, the next tragedy would be even exponentially more painful. 3. The Eastman family, the betrayal of the McCartney lawyers, and the Beatles' financial crisis. In the summer of 1907, an unexpected tragedy struck the Beatles when Brian Epstein, their legendary manager, suddenly passed away from a drug overdose. His death not only took away the band's guiding figure, but also triggered an unprecedented crisis, putting the greatest band in the world on the brink of collapse. None of the four members of the Beatles had any experience running a massive music empire like Apple Corps. Immediately afterward, the company they had founded began to fall into a severe financial crisis, and the need to find a new manager became more urgent than ever. However, it was at this very moment that seeds of division began to appear. Paul McCartney turned to his wife's family, Lee and John Eastman, renowned financial lawyers who were firm, highly respected, and based in New York. In Paul's eyes, the Eastmans were the perfect choice, professional, trustworthy, and capable of protecting the Beatles' future. Yet for John Lennon, George Harrison, and Ringo Starr, the idea seemed like a dangerous trap. They feared that Apple Corps would turn into a McCartney family company, where every important decision would fall into Paul's hands and those of his relatives. Meanwhile, the other three members began to consider alternative options, particularly Alan Klein, a shark in the management world, who had negotiated hard with the Rolling Stones and was famous for his tough, uncompromising style. Lennon, who had always disliked lawyers and tedious paperwork, found Klein appealing because he acted with money and decisive action rather than theory or documents. From that point on, the Beatles were divided into two clear factions. Paul remained steadfast in defending the Eastmans, while John grew increasingly hostile, even publicly mocking them as the McCartney lawyers. In Lennon's view, the Eastman family embodied betrayal. He believed that if these lawyers gained control, the Beatles would no longer be a band of four, but merely Paul's personal asset. The tension reached its climax in 1970 when Paul McCartney officially filed a lawsuit against the other three members, demanding the dissolution of the Beatles to free himself from his obligations to Alan Klein. Behind this lawsuit was none other than the Eastman family. To Lennon, this felt like a fatal stab in the back. The result was the official breakup of the Beatles, with the Eastmans regarded as the cause of the band's collapse. Ironically, over time, Alan Klein also failed to prove himself as a savior. He became embroiled in multiple controversies and was even accused of mismanagement and lack of transparency. Yet Lennon never regretted choosing Klein over the Eastman family. In his eyes, Klein at least fought for himself, whereas the Eastmans remained nothing more than Paul's lawyers and unforgivable betrayers. However, just as these internal fractures had yet to heal, Lennon faced a new adversary, the machinery of power in Washington and the leader of the entire United States. 4. Richard Nixon. When Lennon became an anti-war icon, in 1970, after leaving the Beatles, John Lennon, together with Yoko Ono, moved from London to New York, a city they considered the epicenter of creative freedom and the struggle for peace. There, Lennon was no longer just an ordinary musician. He quickly became a prominent anti-war symbol. He participated in a series of activities, such as the Bed-In for Peace protests, and released the album Sometime in New York City, 1972, which featured songs with sharp political messages like "Woman is the Nigger of the World" and "John Sinclair." Lennon also established relationships with leftist figures such as Jerry Rubin and Abbie Hoffman, leaders of the Yippie movement, which tied his name closely to energetic protests and demonstrations. However, all of this unfolded in an especially sensitive context. In 1972, Richard Nixon launched his campaign for re-election as president. At the same time, Lennon and his allies were planning nationwide concert tours to encourage young voters to cast their ballots against Nixon. An internal FBI report at the time clearly stated, if Lennon is allowed to take the stage, he could incite a large wave of opposition against Nixon. Nixon's concern was not limited to the anti-war songs themselves, but also extended to Lennon's potential to become a dangerous bridge linking music, youth, and the oppositional political movement. And thus, an underground struggle began. In 1972, under pressure from the White House, the U.S. Immigration and Naturalization Service, INS, initiated proceedings to deport John Lennon, citing his 1968 arrest in the United Kingdom for marijuana possession. In reality, this was merely a pretext. Behind the scenes was a comprehensive political campaign. The FBI monitored Lennon almost 24/7, tapped his phones, tracked his correspondence, compiled detailed files, and even classified him as a threat to national security. Lennon and Yoko Ono refused to yield. They hired lawyers and embarked on a 4-year legal battle to secure the right to remain in the United States. During this period, Lennon was nearly strangled by pressure. Many of his performances were canceled due to government interference, and he was prevented from participating in public political activities. Even Yoko faced threats of deportation and was only allowed to stay because of their daughter. The struggle against Nixon demonstrated that Lennon could become a thorn in the eyes of a comprehensive administration. Yet not only in politics, but even within the music industry, Lennon encountered individuals who kept him constantly wary. Among them was a prominent member of the Rolling Stones. 5. Mick Jagger. The Rolling Stones, the follower of the Beatles. In the early 1950s, as the wave of the British invasion swept across the globe, the British and American press quickly painted a picture of a destined rivalry. The Beatles, bright, tidy, and polished, and the Rolling Stones, gritty, wild, exuding a sense of danger. To the public, these two bands seemed to come from completely different worlds. However, behind the dazzling stage lights, their relationship was far more complex than it appeared. From the very beginning, the Beatles indirectly paved the way for the Rolling Stones to rise. Lennon and McCartney were the ones who wrote and gifted the song "I Wanna Be Your Man," 1963, to the group, one of the first hits that helped the Stones assert their position. Conversely, the Rolling Stones also covered songs by the Beatles. Yet the overwhelming shadow of the Fab Four of Liverpool meant that the Stones were constantly labeled as the followers of trends. This irritation gradually turned into open attacks. In the 1970s, John Lennon repeatedly criticized Mick Jagger and the Rolling Stones, claiming that the Stones always copied the Beatles, from album covers and visual style to their strategy for expanding into the American market. A notable example was the Stones' album Their Satanic Majesty's Request, 1967, which Lennon sarcastically dismissed as a faulty version of the Beatles' legendary Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, 1967. It didn't stop there. During a conversation with Jan Wenner, Rolling Stone magazine, 1970, Lennon even mocked, "Mick talks about us just to promote himself. Look at him. He can't even dance without repeating the same old moves." Of course, Mick Jagger did not take a back seat. He insisted that the Stones were the true embodiment of rock, while the Beatles were merely a clean-cut model band catering to mainstream tastes. Jagger even sneered, "The Beatles? After 1966, they didn't really perform live anymore. We still burn it up on stage." These back-and-forth jabs turned the confrontation between the Beatles and the Rolling Stones into a classic derby in rock history. Yet, beneath the public sparring, a subtle bond persisted. Lennon and Jagger were not true enemies. They had appeared on television together, and in 1968, when the Rolling Stones organized the Rock and Roll Circus, Lennon himself participated in the performance. Despite the public barbs, there remained a strange underlying sense of brotherhood. For Lennon, the Rolling Stones and Mick Jagger were both direct rivals and companions in the journey of turning rock and roll into a global language. It was precisely this fierce competition that helped forge legends, ensuring that both names would always run in parallel through history. The Derby with the Rolling Stones showed that Lennon could compete fiercely while also collaborating. But when facing another gentleman, all concessions vanished, because there existed a hidden, undeniable streak of jealousy that could not be concealed. 6. Bob Dylan, talented icon of freedom, or just a pseudo-revolutionary. In 1964, when John Lennon first listened to Bob Dylan's music, the feeling struck him like a lightning bolt straight to the heart. Dylan was completely different from the sweet pop tunes that the Beatles had been pursuing. His distinctive hoarse voice, combined with lyrics full of everyday life, reflecting social injustices and harsh realities, immediately captivated Lennon. This is the true voice of freedom. Thanks to Dylan, the Beatles began opening a new chapter in their music. Moving away from teenage love songs, they transitioned to Rubber Soul and Revolver, albums rich in depth, philosophy, and sometimes even carrying a rebellious spirit. However, that idol soon became a source of disappointment. As John Lennon became increasingly active in anti-war movements and wrote more political songs, he began to notice Dylan's ambivalence. Although Dylan frequently spoke about freedom, he often sought safety within the folk and country music genres. In Lennon's eyes, this felt like a betrayal. An artist using music to glorify revolution, while in real life easily compromising. The conflict was evident not only in words, but also in music. In 1960, Lennon composed Norwegian Wood, a folk song with a hint of Indian influence, clearly inspired by Dylan, yet it carried a subtle satirical tone. Dylan, upon hearing it, did not stay silent. By 1960, he released Fourth Time Around, almost mirroring the melody of Norwegian Wood, but with lyrics full of irony, as if mocking, "This English guy thinks he's clever, but in reality, he's still following me." The confrontation between them grew increasingly tense. Lennon saw himself and the Beatles as the outspoken voice of youth against the war and against Nixon. Dylan, on the other hand, wanted to distance himself from the image of a political icon. He simply wished to focus on his music. To Lennon, this attitude was insincere. In Dylan's eyes, Lennon was too extreme, turning art into a political slogan. Yet in reality, they could not separate from each other. Lennon once admitted, "Every time Dylan releases a new album, I ask myself, how should I respond?" Many years later, Dylan also looked back and said, "No one can write pop music as profoundly as Lennon." Ultimately, their relationship was not entirely hostile, but rather an ongoing, relentless rivalry. Lennon despised Dylan for his ambiguity, while Dylan was irritated by Lennon's extremism. It was precisely this opposition that created one of the greatest artistic confrontations of the 20th century. 7. Frank Sinatra, a classic figure in the world of contemporary music. In the 1960s, the music world resembled a tense battlefield between two generations. On one side stood Frank Sinatra, an icon of the golden era, the refined gentleman of cabarets with smooth, powerful ballads that commanded attention. On the other side were the Beatles, a young band from Liverpool, bringing with them an explosive wave of rock and roll that shattered every traditional musical standard. John Lennon, with his strong and edgy personality, could never hide his irritation at the overly polished voices and classical-style performances like Sinatra's. He believed that music had to genuinely come from the soul, that it should be a scream of emotion rather than meticulously crafted melodies wrapped in a luxurious veneer. The clash between the two sides ignited in 1966. When the Beatles were preparing to release their album Rivalry, Sinatra did not hesitate to mock them. "If you're tired of those shaggy-haired singing boys, then your bird can swing, but you can't hear me." This was an open declaration of war. Sinatra wanted to assert that the long-haired kids were merely putting on a show, while true artistry remained in the hands of masters like himself. John Lennon did not remain silent. He responded with his own music. In the song "And Your Bird Can Sing," Lennon embedded lyrics that struck like sharp daggers, aimed directly at Sinatra. "You may think that you have heard and understood everything, but you cannot comprehend the voice of our generation." What seemed destined to remain a deep rift, however, took an unexpected turn. In 1969, George Harrison composed the song "Something." When Sinatra heard it, he could not hide his admiration. The king of the cabaret, who had once openly mocked the Beatles, now had to sincerely acknowledge their talent. Not only did he cover the song himself, but Sinatra also declared, "This is one of the best love songs written in 50 or even 100 years." This gesture not only demonstrated his absolute respect for George Harrison's artistry, but also marked a surprising moment of reconciliation, dissolving all previous prejudices and conflicts. The relationship between John Lennon and Frank Sinatra was never simply about love or hate. It resembled two rivers flowing in parallel, one representing a glorious past, the other an explosive future. Between them existed contempt, counterattacks, but also acknowledgement. From this very tension, the history of music was woven, proving that sometimes the greatest adversary can also become the greatest witness to each other's talent. However, Lennon was always a complex individual, full of contradictions that were often hard to explain. After his sudden death, a secret notebook caused many to raise questions and doubts. What puzzled people was this: why would someone so famous for being outspoken, who dared to openly criticize the entire world, keep such a list hidden until the very end of his life? The answer lies in Lennon's very character, his courage, and his fearless approach to confrontation. He was so blunt that he could sometimes appear ruthless in public, daring to criticize even his friends, and going so far as to write songs specifically to attack Paul McCartney. At the same time, he understood very well the power and influence that his fame carried. Lennon was renowned for speaking out on things that others kept hidden in their hearts. In the past, he had declared that the Beatles were more famous than Jesus, a statement that immediately sparked a furious backlash. He wrote an entire song aimed at attacking Paul McCartney and did not hesitate to mock Mick Jagger in the press. Yet, when it came to a list that held personal accusations, Lennon chose silence, keeping it private rather than making it public. He knew that if it were revealed, such a list could turn friends into enemies, transforming personal conflicts into a public battle. As an artist who had already been pressured by the FBI, the White House, the media, and even his peers, Lennon understood that sometimes staying silent was not a sign of weakness, but the only way to protect oneself. He could strike through music, but writing each name down and exposing it to the public was a step far too dangerous. Deep down, perhaps Lennon felt some regret. He was angry, writing the names on paper, but he also understood that making it public would mean the end of any chance for reconciliation. That is why he chose to keep it for himself rather than turn it into a form of public entertainment. No artist of that era was monitored as closely by the U.S. authorities as Lennon. After he publicly opposed the Vietnam War, the FBI created files hundreds of pages thick, tapped his phones, read his letters, and even attempted to have him expelled from the United States. Lennon was acutely aware that any word or action could be distorted and used against him. If that notebook had been revealed while he was still alive, it would have become a political weapon in the hands of those who wanted to bring him down. Just one name, one phrase, could be exploited by the media, twisted by the authorities, and Lennon would have been labeled a public enemy of society. In that scenario, the message of Pete he had worked tirelessly to promote would have been completely overshadowed by scandal and controversy. Therefore, the notebook seemed never intended for public eyes. It was a tool for personal release. Lennon wrote not for the world to read, but for himself, as a silent confession. It was his way of confronting the bitterness, betrayal, and anger he had experienced. Lennon was an artist, and every artist needs a place to set down their pain. Others might turn to alcohol, drugs, or violence. Lennon chose to write it down. He poured his anger into words, rather than letting it erupt into real-world conflict. Thus, the notebook became a mirror reflecting his soul, a creative genius, a symbol of peace, but at the same time a deeply conflicted human being, constantly wrestling with the shadows within. It was not a weapon for the public, nor a political manifesto, but a private secret, a small space where he could be honest with himself. There, Lennon did not need to hold up the mantle of the spokesperson of a generation, nor wear the cloak of a hero. He was simply John, a man with ordinary fears, loneliness, anger, and the simple longing for a complete family. It can be said that the notebook was like a private room that no one dared to enter, a space where he could completely relax his mind and lock every door tight. To the outside world, Lennon appeared as a rebel, a powerful anti-war voice, a person daring enough to challenge all conventions. Yet, on those pages, he revealed himself as a vulnerable human being, sometimes angry, sometimes bewildered, and at times even despairing to the point of questioning the very path he was walking. This was a completely different Lennon, not the legendary image, but merely a person trying to survive under the immense pressures the world had placed upon his slender shoulders. It was only when he departed from this world that this secret accidentally came to light. And it made us suddenly realize a profound truth. Even the greatest icons carry within them dark corners that they have never, and perhaps would never, want the public to see while they are alive. It is precisely this that makes Lennon feel closer than ever. For if a towering legend like him had to turn to a notebook to contain his inner struggles, then we, ordinary people, have no reason to feel ashamed for keeping our own deepest feelings to ourselves. Lennon's story reminds us of something profoundly human. Everyone has secrets in life, inner thoughts they wish to keep just for themselves. Some choose to write them in a diary, some hide them in an old drawer, and others lock them in a wooden box under the bed. As for Lennon, he chose the notebook, a place small enough to embrace the storms within his heart, yet wide enough to help him regain balance. There are things that, if spoken aloud, only weigh the heart down further. But by keeping them, we find a way to continue living. The notebook, therefore, was not only a repository for Lennon's pain, but also a support that helped him find the courage to rise, smile for the camera, and hold his guitar while singing songs of love and peace to the world. It was the invisible pillar that allowed him to move forward in a life that had never been easy. This is the truly human aspect of a seemingly distant icon. Lennon was not only a music legend, he was, like us, a wounded human being, constantly finding ways to wrap his pain in order to survive. And perhaps it is precisely this fragility that made Lennon who he really was, a real Lennon, not merely an immortal image on posters or vinyl records colored by the passage of time. Yet, ironically, while the whole world still believed Lennon to be a shining beacon, the notebook revealed a Lennon quietly collapsing in the darkness of his own soul. He had once hidden all his wounds, carefully wrapped them so that no one could see. However, when those pages were exposed after his death, they became a painful testimony. Even the one who sang, "Imagine all the people living life in peace," could not find peace in his own heart. And that, ultimately, is the greatest tragedy of John Lennon, a man only truly understood once he had left this world. If the sounds that have just resonated are still lingering in your mind, leave your thoughts right below. Don't forget to hit like, share with those who are also searching for the truth, and subscribe to the channel, because this journey of discovery is only just beginning. Behind the sparkling glory and seemingly perfect smiles, legends are not built solely from the songs of victory. They also carry wounds that are difficult to heal, hidden pains, and battles that only they themselves can truly understand. There are secrets that seemed to have been buried by time, seemingly leaving no trace behind. Yet even the smallest crack is enough for them to resurface, shaking even the most untouchable monuments. And perhaps everything you have ever known is merely the surface layer. The deepest and darkest part is still patiently waiting for the day it will be revealed.